Hey, it's time for another one of these with your comments and my responses. And God, I've done a lot of Star Trek videos since the last time I did one of these. So let's get started right away or we'll be here all day. This first set of comments is from my recent video done in tribute to Nichelle Nichols. This one is from the Gurkhaman, who says, I like to believe that Nichelle injected some of her own frustration from having to do the translation scene from Undiscovered Country into the scene itself. She'd gone to the screenwriters and said that she felt Uhura would have known Klingon without needing the translator, but they wanted to keep the script as written. That's another reason she was great. She'd stand up for her character when it was needed, but also knew when to diplomatically withdraw. I do know that story, and there were a couple of other people in the comments who also brought up the fact that the Guess Who's Coming to Dinner line was originally scripted to be Uhura's line, and Nichelle Nichols objected to that as well. She felt that it was wrong to have the only black character in the movie, or the only black regular Star Trek character, her character Uhura, say that line, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, in reference to the Klingons, given the history of that line. And, the fact that it was the title of a film starring Sidney Poitier about a black man who is engaged to a white woman and coming home to meet her family. Nichelle Nichols was uncomfortable with that. And she did get that one changed. They give that line to Chekhov in the movie, not to Uhura. But I guess asking to not do the comedy scene with the Klingon translation was just a little bit too far. The filmmakers weren't willing to give her quite that much. So I can definitely imagine that annoyed flipping of the switch that she does at the end and that look on her face. Like, you could, knowing that story, you can easily interpret that as Nichelle Nichols, the actor, going, all right, I did it. Like, are you happy? There, I did it. And it kind of works that way too. Here's one from Catherine Osborne. As a preschooler in the late 70s, I watched TOS pretty much every day with my brother. Seeing a woman on a team and respected set a baseline expectation of workplaces for me. As a programmer, I went to work in a male-dominated industry and had the courage to. And because of that baseline, I was able to stand up for myself and others when people behaved misogynistically or racistly or ableistically. It rankles me when people say diversity and representation don't matter. They do. They really, really do. Absolutely they do. And just think, if it meant that much to you and had that much of an impact on your life, think of all the uncounted thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people who have the same experience and were able to go out into whatever workplace, whatever field of endeavor that they chose and live their lives and make similar choices to the ones that you made because they had that example, because they had seen something on television when they were a kid in their formative years that told them it doesn't have to be this way. It can be better. We can do better. We can demand better from people because you had seen that it was possible. And, we talk a lot about the influence that Star Trek has had on the modern world, or the sort of post-60s world. And we talk in terms of technology and how people were inspired to develop certain devices because they were chasing Star Trek. Cell phones were developed because people wanted to have communicators, and that there were so many people who went into aerospace and went into engineering and went into things related to the space program because of Star Trek. And that's all great. And I think the franchise deserves a lot of credit for that. But what about the people who, some of whom were working in engineering or technological fields or programming, like you said, but no matter what field they went into, no matter what their job ended up being, they had a sense of dignity and an expectation of being treated with respect because they had seen Lieutenant Uhura or Lieutenant Sulu being treated a certain way on Star Trek. And they said, you know what? I don't need to settle for being disrespected because I have seen that. I've seen what it looks like when people from diverse backgrounds work together in a respectful, equal environment on a team. I know that it's possible. I know it can happen, and I am not going to settle for anything less. It didn't just change the culture in terms of inspiring people to invent new things or to change the way things look or to try and recreate the imaginary technology of Star Trek in the real world. It changed the culture in terms of how people treated each other and how people expected others to treat them in the workplace or in environments where there were people of different backgrounds present and maybe not everybody was being treated equally. So, I mean, when I say things like I say in that video that Nichelle Nichols was one of the most important actors in the history of American television, that's a big reason why. Turquoise Supreme, after she died, I ran across Star Trek of Gods and Men and watched her take the lead in that fan-made Star Trek project. It was refreshing to see. Yeah, Of Gods and Men is another one that got mentioned by several people in the comments to that video. And I will say, it was nice to see Uhura take on more of a leading role instead of just being a supporting character. She wasn't really one of the leads in that movie, but her stature in the movie was greatly elevated to where it typically was on the show and in the movies. You know, Uhura by that point was more of sort of an elder stateswoman, and she was regarded with that level of respect and dignity within the story. And that was nice. Personally, I don't think Of Gods and Men is that good. But that's just my own opinion. But if you're looking for the Uhura character to be treated with the importance that she deserves and treated with respect, then it is good for that. And it's nice to see Nichelle as an older person get to play that character again and bring some of her sensibilities as an older person to Uhura and play Uhura in a stage of her life that we don't get to actually see her in any of the official projects. So it's really cool and really valuable for that reason, especially now that Nichelle is no longer with us. These next several comments are from my video about where did Star Trek actually come from. This one is from Ben Jarin, who says, "You forgot to mention Gene Roddenberry's first show, The Lieutenant. It featured many actors who Roddenberry would later call back and hire to appear on Star Trek, like Lenny Nimoy, Nichelle Nichols, Walter Koenig, and Majel Barrett, just to name a few. Indeed, I believe it's where Barrett and Roddenberry met. It wasn't exactly an inspiration for an individual Star Trek script, but it did establish Roddenberry as a showrunner. In other words, if there had been no Lieutenant, there would never have been a Star Trek." I think that is a completely fair statement. Not only was the Lieutenant important because, as you say, it established Roddenberry as a showrunner, although it wasn't called that back then, but one of the episodes of The Lieutenant was actually pulled from broadcast. It was not aired as originally scheduled because it dealt with themes about racism, and the network got nervous about showing it. They felt it was too controversial, so they didn't air it. And that experience, reportedly, is one of the things that inspired Roddenberry to make his next show, which was Star Trek, a science fiction series, so he could write things or produce episodes that had political and social commentaries, but he could do it through metaphor and through analogy. And if the network objected to anything, he could just say, come on, it's a sci-fi show. We're just telling stories, do the Twilight Zone thing. So the Lieutenant is very important for that reason. And in fact, I did a video a week or so ago that talks about that Lost Lieutenant episode, which is the episode that Nichelle Nichols guest stars in. It would have been Nichelle Nichols' television debut had it aired as originally scheduled, but it never did. Or it has aired on cable and stuff since then. And of course, it's been released on DVD, which is how I got to see it. But it was not aired originally when it was supposed to be broadcast. And I did a whole video about it. It's on the channel. There's a link in the description to it. And also there's a link up there in a card if you want to click that. But you can watch my video all about that Lost episode of The Lieutenant and sort of how it deals or fails to deal with issues related to racism, and how it sort of was a prelude to Roddenberry getting more political and more social commentary with Star Trek a few years later. There's one from Jeremiah McCarroll. "I remember hearing the idea that Star Trek was the next logical step after the Twilight Zone. That makes sense to me, but I haven't watched very many TZ episodes, so it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about it." I love the Twilight Zone, and one of the highest compliments that I can ever pay to anything is to say that it reminds me of a Twilight Zone episode. And there are definitely Star Treks that remind me of Twilight Zone episodes. So in that sense, I think you could say that Star Trek is a product of the Twilight Zone, or a step a little further down the same road that the Twilight Zone is on. I mean, Twilight Zone is an anthology show and Star Trek isn't. So I suppose if you believe that a show with a recurring cast is the next logical step after an anthology, then you could say that Star Trek is the next logical step because both shows deal with political and social commentary through metaphor and through science fiction and fantasy stories. I guess you could call it the next logical step in that way. But, there's a lot of differences between the shows too. So I want to be careful about citing the Twilight Zone specifically as an influence on Star Trek, because I don't know for sure that it was. I do know that the Twilight Zone was very influential, just broadly speaking. I mean, it was one of many successful anthology shows that were on at around the same time in the late 50s and early 60s, and it came after some of those, but came before others, so it was both influenced by and also influencing later things. I don't know how much influence Gene Roddenberry consciously or unconsciously took from the Twilight Zone. So I'm not sure how closely linked they are in that way, but there are definitely Star Trek episodes that remind me of Twilight Zones. And when I say that, I really like the show because Twilight Zone is one of my all-time favorite shows. And if there's a Star Trek episode that makes me think, oh, this feels like a Twilight Zone, chances are very good that it's one of my favorite episodes. Here's one from One Monkey. Morbius leaned forward and fitted the 3 extensions of the Krell learning device to his head. "Gentlemen," he said to the gathered visitors, "it's Morbin time." That was my best Walter Pidgeon. It wasn't very good, and I apologize for that. But yes, if you can picture Walter Pidgeon's voice in your head, if you can hear it much better than my poor attempt at an impersonation just now, and you can hear Walter Pidgeon as Dr. Morbius saying, "It's Morbin time," in that indelible voice and tone that he had, then that's super funny. Good job. That's super funny. There were so many "It's Morbin time" jokes in the comments for that video. It was really kind of a snapshot of where the internet was at that time, like 2 months ago. Christopher Davis, now I want to see the Trek Actually episode where Steve compares Star Trek episodes that rip off other Star Trek episodes. Oh, so you want to see another video about Star Trek Voyager? I gotta get my shots in at Voyager. I don't do it very often anymore because people took it the wrong way and thought I was filled with hatred, and I'm not. But I gotta get my shots in at Voyager every so often. Yeah, if I was going to do a video about Star Trek episodes that rip off other Star Trek episodes, there'd be a lot of Voyager in that video. It's like sometimes I think, when Seth MacFarlane went in to Fox to pitch the Orville, and he said, look, I just want to do a show that's just like Star Trek The Next Generation. I basically want to do another Star Trek The Next Generation. And there was some Fox executive who was like, didn't they do that already? And wasn't it called Star Trek Voyager? So, anyway. If I ever feel like really just taking a hatchet to Voyager again, I might do the episode about Star Trek shows that ripped off other Star Trek shows. Lee S. Fan 2000. The robot doesn't need a name. He's such an iconic representation of a robot that he can simply be identified as the robot. Also, he kicked Robbie's ass in the episode War of the Robots, effectively proving his superiority, and in Robbie's second appearance, The Condemned of Space, the robot doesn't even give him the time of day. Robbie is a more prolific actor, though. I'll give him that. Yeah, because Robbie has range, unlike the robot from Lost in Space. And look, listen, no disrespect to the robot from Lost in Space. I love the Lost in Space robot. I really do. And War of the Robots is such a fun episode. Although I must point out, you say the robot beats Robbie's ass in that episode. Gee, I wonder why that could be. You think it could be because Robbie was guest starring on the Robots show? Maybe that was it. It's just like back in the early 2000s when the Hush storyline was first running through the Batman comic. And I read an interview with Jeff Loeb at the time, and there's that issue of Hush where Batman and Superman have a fight because Superman is being mind controlled by Poison Ivy. And they have a fist fight, and Batman beats him. And, of course, Batman has the kryptonite ring, and that's what allows Batman to defeat Superman, because he has the kryptonite ring. But even with the kryptonite ring, it's a little far-fetched to be like, oh, Batman just beat up Superman? And somebody asked Jeff Loeb, even with the kryptonite ring as the advantage, how could Batman win a fight with Superman? And Jeff Loeb said, because it's Batman's book. So, like, of course, the robot from Lost in Space defeats Robbie the robot in an episode of Lost in Space. If that is not the way it had gone, then if I were the robot, I would have been asking for a release from my contract. And clearly that did not happen, which was very smart on the part of the producers of Lost in Space, because, you know, it's like, you got Dr. Smith, you got the robot, those are your breakout characters. Everybody else, no disrespect to the incredibly talented Bill Mumy, who was Will Robinson. But, I mean, you take out Dr. Smith and the robot from Lost in Space, and, I mean, what do you got? Got to keep the robot happy. Can't have him doing jobs for Robbie, you know? These next few comments are from my recent video about my favorite scene from Star Trek VI. This one is from Wreck-It127. My favorite part of Let Them Die is the contrast from the intensity Kirk shows uttering the statement, which almost immediately fades as he starts to realize what he said, but rather than walking it back, he pivots away to, it's time for us to retire. It's incredibly human, and Shatner did a great job acting it. Yes, he did. But as other people in the comments to that video pointed out, that was not the full performance that Shatner gave in that take, because Shatner, there was a lot of this going around on Star Trek VI, apparently. The actors were uncomfortable with the lines they were given. Shatner did not like having Kirk say, let them die, and having him be so cold-hearted. So Shatner did a take where, and I think it's actually the take that is in the movie, but it's just edited, so some of Shatner's performance is strategically cut out, where he says, let them die. And then he takes a pause, and then he kind of goes like this, you know, like, never mind, like, forget I said that. He kind of sort of waves it off. And then he says, has it occurred to you that this crew is due to stand down in 3 months? And he goes into that bit that you're talking about where he changes the subject. And Nicholas Meyer and his editors just cut out the part where Kirk waves it off. And it is so much better that way. You don't want Kirk to wave it off. You don't want to see Kirk acknowledging that what he said was wrong in the very first scene in the movie. His character arc is that he comes to realize how wrong he was. He comes to realize how prejudiced he is and how corrosive that prejudice is. And he gets there through the course of the story. If you have him already kind of be there in his first scene, then it totally guts his character arc. So Nicholas Meyer made the right choice to say, yeah, sure, let do whatever you need to do on camera to get it so I get the shot that I need. If you need to have Kirk go, forget I said that, never mind. Go ahead, do that. Nobody's ever going to see it. I'm going to cut that out. I'm going to take the good parts, the parts that work for the character and work for the film, and I'm going to put that in. And you're right, it's a terrific performance from Shatner, but it is improved by judicious editing done in service of the vision of a very smart director, Nicholas Meyer. Here's one from Aaron Litz. Personally, I also love the scene where Spock gets enraged at Valeris. Seeing Spock in a barely controlled rage and tearing the identities of the other conspirators from her mind was scary. Yes, I believe I've talked about this scene in other videos as well, because it's a scene that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And I think that's kind of the point. It makes Spock uncomfortable too. We've never seen Spock use a mind meld like that, where it's done without a person's consent, and it's done violently. Like, she tries to pull away at one point, and Spock holds her in place. He grabs the back of her head and holds her in place, and then uses both hands. And by the end of it, she's screaming in pain. And when it's over, Spock is visibly disturbed as well. Again, smart acting. Leonard Nimoy plays that just right. He knows that Spock is crossing a line here. And he's doing... It's the equivalent of torture. It's the equivalent of torturing a suspect because you feel like there's a ticking clock and you have no other choice. And Spock does this thing that compromises his ethics, that is a display of emotion, that is a loss of control, and is wrong in many ways. But he does it because he feels he has to in the moment. And he is disturbed by it. He's upset. The way he plays that moment after he releases the meld, when he lets her go and he goes, she doesn't know. And he's clearly shaken. So it's a great scene all around. And one of the things about it is a lot of people don't like it because it's a very uncomfortable scene, but I think it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to watch that scene and go, yeah, get her, Spock. You're supposed to be upset by it because what just happened is upsetting. That's part of what makes it such a memorable scene and such a good scene. Here's one from Bjorn Nilsson. Maybe I'm guilty of overthinking this, but I've always interpreted the old and inflexible line here in the context of breaking the fifth wall. It's not so much about the characters of Spock and Kirk in the story as it is a direct plea directed at the fan base to adjudicate the future of the franchise. Well, thank goodness we all got that message, huh? Now, these next several comments are from my video about how the holodeck would be an HR nightmare. This is from Callisto91. It's kind of an existential nightmare, too. I mean, people in the real world sometimes wonder if they're living in the Matrix. Imagine how much more pronounced that would be in a world where high-quality false realities are an everyday fact. I bet quite a few Federation types have, in a moment of stress, shouted, "Computer and program," just in case they're in a holodeck simulation. Oh my God, and can you imagine the pranks? I mean, I know that supposedly humanity has evolved by the time we get to the TNG era, so you would think that pranks, the lowest form of humor imaginable, would no longer be in style, and people wouldn't really do that anymore because we've evolved beyond our infancy. But if there are still people who pull pranks in the Federation on Earth, imagine the absolutely vicious pranks, the psychologically ruinous pranks you could pull if you had access to a holodeck, where you could just wait till somebody falls asleep and then beam them into a holodeck simulation of their life without them knowing about it. And then, I mean, you could fuck with them in any way you could imagine. You could totally destroy their sense of reality. You could mentally disintegrate somebody as a prank. Gotcha! It was all a holodeck. You've been in the holodeck for the last 2 days. This hasn't been your life at all. We sure gotcha. It would be horrible. It would be horrible. John Dittmer, Steve, you should also consider that there would be a protocol to announce that you're going into a holodeck. Sometimes people might want to go into the holodeck to have a private conversation or scene like when Geordi was on a date on the beach in the holodeck. That way, the people in the holodeck would have an opportunity to turn off the scene. So many of the problems that we see dealt with in holodeck episodes, specifically by Barclay, where people are interrupted during what turn out to be embarrassing programs, could have been prevented by the careful and consistent use of 3 magic words. Are you decent? Big Nose Doggy. It still amazes me that it took the writers over 2 years to realize the most obvious way people would use the holodeck. Sure, it would be fun to fight monsters or pretend to be your favorite superhero, but you're more likely to use it to say things to your boss or coworkers that you couldn't do in real life. Married people would use it to satisfy their fantasies. You know, it's probably not so much a case that it took the writers that long to realize it. It's probably more that it took them that long to figure out how to use it in a story. Because you're right. I mean, there are certain uses of the holodeck. Like, as soon as you imagine the holodeck, there are certain uses that just sort of suggest themselves. You know? Like, we're not all going to use this for constructive purposes. We're not all going to use it as, like, you know, a training tool. We're going to do sex stuff, and we're going to act out like petty revenge fantasies against people that we couldn't do this to in real life. Like, those are going to be major uses of the holodeck. I'm pretty sure the writers figured that out pretty early on, but how do you work that into a story? And they figured it out with Barclay. They were able to have a guest character sort of deal with these issues, and the regular characters deal with these issues through the guest character's story. So they figured it out, but it maybe took them a few years to figure it out. But I think that was what needed figuring out. Not, oh, I just realized people would use the holodeck for this stuff. It's more, okay, how do we work this into the show? How do we make a story out of this? And when they did figure it out, it was worth the wait because Hollow Pursuits is a really, really terrific episode. Here's one from Obsidian. Yeah, I always thought it surely would have been against regulations to simulate your crewmates, especially how Barclay was doing it. Do likeness rights not exist in this future? I mean, not to get too crass, but if the computer can perfectly replicate a body, then people can view any part of your body without your knowledge. I know they are evolved superhumans in the shows barring DS9 Enterprise, but the holosuites exist, don't appear to be off limits to Starfleet officers, and consent is consent. I think this is a facet of the issue that a lot of people who just kind of shrug it off and say, well, it's a person's private business and who cares? If somebody wants to create a hologram of me in their private holodeck fantasy, what do I care? It has nothing to do with me. I'm never going to see it anyway. Fair enough. But have you really thought through, are you comfortable with anybody who wants to see you naked, seeing you naked? Now, maybe you are. And if you are, great, good for you, but not everybody is. It is a consent issue. It is a privacy issue. It is, as you say, a likeness rights issue. What if I don't want people to be able to make a perfect copy of me on a holodeck and do whatever they want to with it? What if I don't want that? Should there be a mechanism where I can prevent people from doing that? I mean, a lot of people would say there should be. Or there should be some kind of protection in place. At the very least, you shouldn't be allowed to do it while you're at work with those people, which I think was one of the big points that I tried to push in that video. It's not just that Barclay is creating holographic versions of people of real people and putting them into fantasy scenarios. It's that he's doing this with people that he works with while he is at work, using the holodeck at work. I mean, yeah, the Enterprise is a little more complicated because it's not just where they work, it's also where they live. And presumably most people who use the holodeck use it when they are off duty, but nevertheless, they're sharing a space with all of these people. And if you are using the holodeck to recreate real people that you actually work with or live with on the ship, and you're doing stuff with that recreation that this person, the real person, doesn't know about and didn't consent to and would not want to be done, they might have a problem with that. It might create a problem. So a lot of it is a consent issue. You know, just because you would have no problem with it doesn't mean that everybody wouldn't have a problem with it. And is that something that deserves serious consideration? Here are some comments from my video about what the writers of new Star Trek shows can learn from TNG. This one is from Bill Johnston. One of my favorite things about DS9 is that they went 176 episodes without doing a single Borg episode. They even had a massive tempting hook with Sisko's past, and they still resisted it. I suppose we could say resistance is not futile. In this case. I'm sorry. I apologize. Actually, I'm not sorry. I take that back. I retract the apology. I'm not sorry at all. I regret nothing. Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about Deep Space Nine, too. They didn't reuse antagonists from the other show. I mean, they kind of did with the Cardassians. The Cardassians were established in TNG, and then they were brought into DS9. But DS9 really built them up and did things with them beyond what had been done in TNG. And yes, they avoided really obvious ones like the Borg. They had Captain Sisko's backstory, and they did use that for something. They used it to explain why he doesn't like Captain Picard. So it's relevant to the first episode. And it's relevant to sort of setting Sisko apart from Picard, which is another thing I loved about it from the beginning, that it was saying this is going to be a different show. This captain is not going to be like Picard. In fact, he doesn't even like Picard. He's a different guy, and he thinks Picard is a jerk. So it's useful for that. But no, the Borg do not become an antagonist of Sisko, even though there is a built-in reason for it in Sisko's backstory, because the creators of Deep Space Nine, as I think is made very obvious throughout the entire run of that show, did not want to just do the same thing that had been done before. They wanted to do different stuff. They wanted to do stuff that was just for their show. And over the years, they did a really good job of that. And they didn't need the Borg. They came up with their own stuff. that was just as good, if not better, than the Borg, and was original. So, unfortunately, the writers of Voyager did not make the same decision. The writers of Voyager tried to come up with compelling antagonists of their own for the first couple of seasons, and when nothing really stuck, either they or someone from the studio or whoever came up with the idea of, screw it, let's just do the Borg, and the rest, unfortunately, is history. But so I give the writers and producers of Deep Space Nine a ton of credit that it was sitting right there. The reason to bring the Borg into their show was sitting right there, and they never touched it. Singular Rockheart says, it could have worked for Voyager to use the Borg the way Firefly used the Reavers, but not how Serenity used them. The unseen terror on the fringes. You hope you never cross paths, you run if you do, and encountering where they were previously is unsettling. 7 of 9 can still work in that context, too. Oh, absolutely, you could have had them find 7 of 9 and have her join the crew in a way kind of similar to the way the Enterprise found Hugh in the episode I, Borg. You know, she could have been part of a wrecked Borg cube or a derelict, abandoned Borg cube that Voyager ran into. But yes, I definitely agree. Having the Borg be the almost entirely unseen threat that is presumed to be all around, but they never or almost never actually see and encounter, that would have been such a better use of the Borg than the way they did it. It would have avoided the problem of overkill. It would have kept the Borg mysterious and scary, and they still could have been present, right? If you wanted to do the thing where like, oh, we can't just ignore the Borg because they're in the Delta Quadrant, and we said already that the Borg are from the Delta Quadrant, so it would be weird to just not have them in the show at all. Okay, fine. I mean, I would be totally fine with just not having them in the show at all, you know, or doing one episode to bring 7 of 9 in, and then that's it. But if you wanted to have the Borg be a presence in the series, but not completely ruin them with overkill, then doing it that way would be a great way to do it. The Borg are out there somewhere, and everybody knows it. We know we're in their space or close to their space, or we know that they're around, but we never actually see them, or we only actually see them very, very rarely. And as you say, if you do encounter them, the response is get out of there, run. There's no defeating the Borg. There's only escaping the Borg. That would have been so much better. God, now that you brought that up, it's bringing back all of my disappointment about the way the Borg are handled on Voyager, and it would have been so much better if it had been done the way you suggest. Oh, it hurts. Oh, it hurts. Here's one from Jeffrey Bozer. Me and my friend had a problem with Voyager running into repeating enemies. They are supposed to be rapidly traversing the Delta Quadrant in a ship faster than most, so why do they keep running into the same people? It's another example, I think, of how the show failed to capitalize on its premise. The premise of Voyager not only holds several options to make the show interesting, but to also make it different from other Star Trek shows. And one of the things that could have made it both interesting and different from other Star Trek shows was, because of the nature of the show, because the idea is they are trying to get out of here, they're trying to get home, to have very little in the way of repeat alien races. I mean, you could have some of it, because you would imagine, well, there would be aliens that have different outposts or control vast territory. So even if you play it so that Voyager is just on a straight line back to the Alpha Quadrant, you could still have, it would still be reasonable to have them encounter the same members of the same species every now and then. But for the most part, I think it would have been way better to just not have them, not have the Kazon be an established recurring threat, or the Hirogen, or who are the other, the Vidians. Like, there were a couple of aliens that became sort of recurring threats. We would see them, or obviously the Borg. To not do that, if they run into a hostile alien, it's something new. It's something we've never seen before. Because that's part of the premise of the show. They're not sticking around in one place for very long. They're constantly on the go because they're trying to get home. You could use that to make it an interesting show and to set it apart from other shows in the franchise. And they never really did that. And that's why I say that, for as much as I like to rag on Voyager and make fun of it and talk about how it's my least favorite show in the franchise, one of the reasons I say those things and feel the way I feel is because it has such wasted potential. It could have been such a great show, or at the very least, a more unique, special show in the franchise. And it just wasn't. And one of the reasons is because they failed to capitalize on the bits of the show's starting premise that could have brought those things to life. Here's one from Seraphonica. How do you feel about the idea that maybe the reason TNG took so long to get into the swing of things was because it didn't use many elements or characters from TOS? I really don't think that had anything to do with it at all. In fact, I think if TNG had situated itself closer to TOS and used more elements from TOS, it would have taken even longer. One of the things that held TNG back in its first season or two, and one of the things that makes it so that it doesn't really become a reliably good show until season 3, is that it took so long to find itself, to find its own voice, to figure out what it was going to be. It feels like it took the producers and the writers that long to work out, okay, what is this show? And if they had started with a bunch of stuff that they took from classic Trek, so they were starting with leftovers, and then they would have to figure out how to make it its own thing, I think it would have taken even longer. So I don't think, if anything, more references and more elements taken directly from TOS would have been a hindrance to the show finding its voice. Now, these next several comments are from my video about the cast of Deep Space Nine and Imposter Syndrome. Here's one from Caitlin L. Another one which comes to mind is Jake's journey over the course of Nor the Battle to the Strong. It's more minor. He's never in doubt about, e.g., his writing abilities, but he doubts his inner strength, his temerity, his ability to stay calm whilst witnessing terrible suffering. Arguably, this pays off when he's able to hang around for the Dominion occupation. Yeah, that is a good example. That's a good point. And also, specifically in terms of imposter syndrome, you could bring in the fact that Jake does not want to join Starfleet, that he chooses a career outside the service. And there is that episode where he tells his dad that he doesn't want to go to the academy, he doesn't want to be in Starfleet. And Ben always sort of assumed that Jake would do that Jake would want to follow in his footsteps. And Ben is really cool about it. And it doesn't become a thing between them. Like, Sisko is very supportive of his son. But you can still easily imagine Jake having that fear, before he reveals that to his dad, before they actually talk about it, where he wonders, like, I hope he doesn't think of me differently as a result of this. I hope when I tell him I don't want to go to the academy that he doesn't think of me as, not being right, or, well, but you're my son. Of course you're going to the academy, I hope it doesn't go that way. And of course it doesn't, because we see that Sisko is a really good dad and he and Jake have a good relationship, but you could not blame Jake for thinking that, for having that insecurity. So I think that's a big part of it too. Meta Sin for Your Soul. DS9 deals with imposter syndrome, or at least something similar, very literally in the trilogy of episodes surrounding Lee Nallas. He was in a Cardassian labor camp, and after returning home, he feels like a fraud because he literally is. But not one of his own making. The myth and legend surrounding him is what allowed his people to beat the Cardassians, even if it was all built on a lie and misunderstanding. And because he knows the truth, Lee not only doesn't believe he can unite the planet, he actively tries to run away, saying basically, look, buddy, I've done enough. This legend of mine has done enough, and I'm going. And Sisko, I suspect, is also talking to himself a little bit when he convinced Lee Nallas to stay instead of running. You know what? I compliment you on this. The Lee Nallas arc in Deep Space Nine would have been a terrific example to talk about in that video. I completely missed it because I was focusing on the regular cast. But yeah, I mean, maybe even more so than Bashir's story. I think Lee Nollis's story is the best match for what people actually experience as imposter syndrome, because he is having to live up to a legend that people have created around him that is not true. And he does have to deal with the fact that he feels like he is not the person people think he is, because in many ways he isn't. Yeah, that's a really, really good catch. Like, I wish that I had incorporated that into that video now, because it's such a good example of a character from Deep Space Nine, not one of the regular heroes of Deep Space Nine, but he is an important character in those 3 episodes, dealing with imposter syndrome. That's a great example. That's a great example. Damn. Oh, I wish I had thought of that. Here's one from Mark Nyland. On the other hand, there was that time we spent an entire episode following around a literal imposter O'Brien. God, there's another one. God. I mean, I do like my O'Brien joke. You know what I mean? Like, I like what I say about O'Brien in the video, where I say, like, he doesn't have imposter syndrome because he doesn't have an inner life at all. So it never occurs to him to think of himself as an imposter. Like, I think that's a really good O'Brien joke, and I'm happy with that as I wrote it. But maybe I could have tacked on a reference to the Imposter O'Brien episode, like at the end of that, to acknowledge that, oh yeah, except for that time where there was literally an O'Brien imposter. The jokes I wish I had thought of. With the Lee Nollis thing, it's like, oh, I wish I had told that story in the video. And with this one, it's like, oh, I wish I had thought of that joke. It would have been such a good joke. These are my favorite and least favorite comments. The comments from viewers who point out things that I didn't do, but as soon as it's pointed out to me, I think, oh, why didn't I do that? It's both invigorating and also crushing, because it's like, oh, I should have, you know what it is? It gives me imposter syndrome, because I think if I were really the great YouTuber that some people, a very small number of people, tell me that I am, I would have got there. I would have found that joke on my own, or I would have realized that Lee Nollis shit without having to have somebody point it out to me after the fact. If I was really as good as people think I am, or as I like to say I am, I would have got that shit. See, now I have imposter syndrome. Fuck. And finally, these last several comments are from my most recent Trek Actually video about the Star Trek comics that were published between the movies Star Trek 3 and Star Trek 4. This one is from Denise Bluth. This seems like as good a place as any to bring this up, but am I the only one who thinks that Robin Curtis's Saavik is hugely underrated? Unlike The Wrath of Khan, where she's mostly there to roll her eyes at the wacky humans, The Search for Spock gives her a lot more to do, and Curtis handles some potentially tricky moments really well. The Pon farr scene could have been totally laughable, but she makes it work. She deserves far better than to be dismissed as not Kirstie Alley. I agree with you. I think that Robin Curtis is terrific as Saavik, and you know what? Unlike Kirstie Alley, after Star Trek 3, Robin Curtis guest starred on an episode of MacGyver. So take that, Kirstie Alley. And yes, I agree with you. I do think her Saavik is quite good, not just in the Pon farr scene, which, yes, is a good scene, but also I've always really liked her line reading when she tells Kirk about David. It's a very Vulcan line reading, but she injects just enough emotion into it so you can tell that she's upset, and she's masking it. The way she says, Admiral, David is dead. She gives it the Vulcan reading, but there's just enough humanity in there that makes you think like, oh, fuck. Like she's really torn up about this. She does have emotion. She's feeling it. And that is the prompt for Shatner to do his super emotional response. So she does the kind of holding back the emotion, the understatement, the Vulcan take, and that is the launching pad for Shatner to do his Shatner thing and to fall off the chair and go, Klingon bastards, you've killed my son. It provides some contrast with that. So yeah, she's very good. She doesn't get her due because, Kirstie Alley originated the character, and Robin Curtis is the recast, and you're always going to be starting in a hole with that if the original version was well regarded, which the original version of Saavik was. But yeah, I think she does a terrific job. Matt McIrvin, at 4 minutes and 59 seconds, I'm immediately reminded of Star Trek TNG's Family, one of the best and, in a way, most radical episodes of the series, because that kind of thing appeared so rarely. I was going to wonder what happened to Mirror Spock's revolution that was implied at the end of Mirror Mirror, but I guess in these stories we kind of get the beginning of it. As far as Family, that was definitely the episode that I was thinking of when I read that issue of the comic. I think Family is really the only episode like that I can think of in Star Trek that feels the way that issue of the comic feels, where it is an in-between things episode. Where, yes, there's a plot, there are things happening. It's not just the characters sitting around talking about their feelings, but it's not a typical Star Trek story. It's about the characters dealing with the aftermath of a really, really heavy bunch of stuff that they just went through. And Star Trek doesn't often do that. And Family is an example of them doing it on the TV series. And that post-Star Trek 3 issue of the comic is an example of it from the comics. And really the only difference between that comic and what it does and Family is that the comic does end on a cliffhanger that, or not a cliffhanger, but a tease that pulls us into the story in the next issue. Whereas Family doesn't have that. Family is completely self-contained. But yeah, obviously they are of the same kind. And as for Mirror Spock, yeah, it's addressed in the comic. There's a line when Prime Kirk meets Mirror Spock again for the first time after having left him way back in the Mirror Mirror episode. And he says, hey, wait a minute. When we left each other way back then, I thought you were going to start a revolution and change the Empire because we agreed that the Empire was illogical and it could not endure. And Mirror Spock's answer is basically, yeah, I thought about it, but I changed my mind. But then you're right. As a result of the comic story, he eventually does join the revolution. But the explanation for why it takes him so long after Mirror Mirror is, I thought about it and I just decided, nah. Wordfish trombone. Imagine a room of kindergartners congratulating each other with a chipper, now you're shitting in tall cotton. Great video idea. Not what I expected, but it was a fun romp. I don't have to imagine it because because I lived it. Here's one from Michael Phillips. Star Trek 3 has the biggest plot flaw of any Star Trek episode or film. It's simply this. Why do they take Dr. McCoy to the Genesis planet? Sarek admonishes Kirk for not taking Spock's Katra to Mount Seleia, which is on Vulcan. At the time this happens, for all anyone knows, Spock's body has been destroyed, having been shot out of a photon torpedo tube into space and falling into orbit around a newly forming planet. Even if they had some reason to believe his body wasn't destroyed, it was dead. Dead from the radiation burns, and would have been useless for restoring Spock's Katra. There was no way for Kirk and company to know that Spock's body has been rejuvenated by the Genesis planet and was ripe for re-implantation. Even the audience doesn't know that because Dr. Marcus and Saavik haven't discovered it yet. Kirk is wrangling the Admiral to get an authorized flight to Genesis around the time that Marcus and Saavik are finding the empty torpedo tube. They had no reason to even imagine going to Genesis, and yet they do because the plot requires that they do. The plot knows that Spock's body is there, even if the characters don't. Well, Michael, I have to compliment you on this. You have pointed out a plot hole that I never noticed before, and I agree with you. I do think it is a plot hole. Now, I don't agree with everything you say in your comment. When you say, why would Kirk want to go to Genesis in the first place, even if they could somehow be assured that Spock's body was there to be gotten, why would they want to go in the first place? Because Spock is dead and they don't know that resurrecting him is an option at this point. I don't think Kirk is going in with the idea of bringing Spock back to life in mind, because as you point out, there's no reason to think that that's an option. He's going, I think, to get Spock's body, to bring Spock's body and Spock's katra, which is contained in McCoy's brain, to Vulcan so that Spock can be at peace. Because remember, McCoy, speaking with Spock's voice at the beginning of the movie, he says to Kirk, "You left me on Genesis. Why did you do that?" So that gives Kirk the message, oh, leaving Spock's body on Genesis was the wrong thing to do. And that's reiterated later on when he talks to Sarek. And Sarek says, "Why did you leave him on Genesis?" Now we could say, well, Sarek is saying that because Sarek thinks that Spock's katra was still with his body. But we know that McCoy, who has Spock's katra, also said that. So either way, Kirk gets the message, I shouldn't have left Spock's body on Vulcan. So or I shouldn't have left Spock's body on Genesis. So he's going to Genesis so he can get it and take it to Vulcan, along with McCoy and the katra, and then it can be at peace. He's wanting to give his friend peace. He's risking all of that to bring his friend a dignified, peaceful burial, basically. And if you look at it that way, it's even more poignant than it might otherwise be, because he's not doing this to bring Spock back. He's doing it to lay Spock to rest. And he's still risking his career and everything to do it. So it adds a layer of dedication and friendship and poignancy to it. But where I have to give you credit is when you point out that Kirk cannot be sure that Spock's body is even intact on the planet, because the last time he saw it, he was shooting a torpedo at the planet. And he has no way of knowing that Spock's body is even exists anymore. How does he know the torpedo didn't just crash into the Genesis planet and it was completely vaporized, right? Because remember, when David and Saavik find it on the planet, David is surprised to see it intact. He says, oh, the gravitational fields are in flux because the planet is still forming. It must have soft landed. It's a surprise to him. So there's no way that Kirk could have possibly known. So that, to me, is the plot hole that you are pointing out. And I give you credit for that, because you're right. As far as I can tell, there's no way that Kirk would have been able to know, at least not with any degree of certainty, that it would have been worth risking everything he risks to go to Genesis because he thought Spock's body was intact. There's no way he could have known that. So that's the plot hole. And I never thought of that before. And but here's the thing. It's not going to change the way, and I'm not saying that you're arguing that it should change the way I view the film. You're just pointing out a plot hole. But it doesn't change my opinion of the movie. I still think Star Trek III is a really great, underrated movie in the franchise. And the fact that there's a little bit of it where you just have to kind of go with it, that doesn't bother me. In fact, most plot holes in good movies are like that. It's something that you either don't notice at all while you're watching it because the movie is so good and it grabs you and it pulls you along and you're invested in it. And you notice a little bit later when you're thinking about it, it's like fridge logic. We're like, wait a minute, how did he know that Spock's body was on Genesis in the first place? How does he know it didn't, it wasn't destroyed when he launched the torpedo, right? It occurs to you later and you think, yeah, it doesn't make sense, does it? But it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect your opinion of the film because, look, there's no such thing as a perfect movie. Every movie has plot holes. Every TV series has plot holes. There's no such thing as a perfect movie or a perfect TV show or even the perfect idea for a TV show. It just doesn't exist. Capital Flash, shame there was no comic documenting adult Spock repeating high school on Vulcan. I think I have to take back that bit that I just said. Because yeah, that's it. Spock repeating high school. Adult Spock repeating high school on Vulcan. It's the perfect idea for a Star Trek show. There it is. Wow. Thank you, Capital Flash. Nice work. Nice work. Spock is in too much stuff as it is, but that's a good enough idea that I would totally be like, yeah, one more Spock show's not going to hurt. Come on. One more Spock show's not going to hurt anybody. We have to do this, right? Yeah. That's worth 10 episodes on Paramount Plus, wouldn't you think? I think so. Anyway, that's it for the comments. That was the last one. Thank you all so much for leaving so many awesome comments on my videos. If I don't talk about one of your comments on these comment response videos, it's only because, I don't want to be doing 3, 4, 5 hour videos where I'm just sitting here responding to comments. I mean, it's nothing personal. There's only so much time in the video, and there are only so many comments that I can respond to, and there are only so many comments that I have interesting things to say in response to. So it's not you, it's me, right? And the nature of, limited time. But thank you all so much for watching my stuff and for leaving comments and for asking such awesome questions and for making such great observations and pointing out things that I miss. Like, that is awesome. And in all seriousness, all joking aside, that is awesome. It's one of my favorite things about doing these videos and doing these comment videos is when one of you points out something that I missed. That is awesome. So thank you so much. I'll be back soon with another Star Trek video, and I'll be back with other videos about all kinds of other stuff as well. So I hope you'll watch those and enjoy those and leave comments on those as well. I appreciate you. I appreciate your support. If you want to support my channel financially, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, or click the join button to become a channel member. Or if you want to just leave a one-time donation instead of signing up for like a regular monthly donation, you can hit the thanks button and make a gift there, or send me some money through PayPal or Venmo. Links to those are in the description. Thank you all to all of you who support the channel or are thinking of supporting the channel or have ever supported the channel in any way. I could not do this without you. And if you're able to and you enjoy my work, please consider supporting the channel because it is really important. But regardless of whether you do or ever have or ever will, thank you so much for watching. And take care, everybody. I'll see you next time.